Everly Sinclair and Kieran Holt thought they had committed the perfect crime. They had planned every detail, staged the scene flawlessly, and erased every trace of their involvement. But as investigators dug deeper into Nolan Barrett's brutal murder, tiny cracks in their story began to form, cracks that would soon shatter their carefully crafted lies and expose the horrifying truth behind their deadly scheme. Everly Dane had always imagined a different life for herself. She had dreams of traveling, of being free, of escaping the small apartment where she felt trapped with a man she no longer loved. When she first met Nolan Creed, things had been exciting. He was hard-working, dependable, and eager to build a future together. They moved in quickly, and within a year, Everly was pregnant. At first, she thought having a child would bring them closer, but instead, it only made her feel more stuck. The long nights with a crying baby, the endless financial struggles, and Nolan's exhausting work schedule slowly drained the excitement she once felt. Nolan worked in construction, often leaving before sunrise and coming home well after dark. He was good at what he did, but it didn't bring in much money, and Everly found herself frustrated with their financial situation. She worked as a waitress at a small diner, pulling long shifts while juggling motherhood. The tips were unpredictable, the customers demanding, and the hours unforgiving. She felt like she was constantly running on empty, and every time she looked at Nolan, all she saw was a man who wasn't giving her the life she wanted. It was at the diner that she met Kieran Holt. He was a cook, a few years older than her, and had an easy way about him. Unlike Nolan, he listened when she talked. He noticed when she was tired and cracked jokes to make her smile. He told her she deserved more, that she shouldn't have to struggle so much, that she was too young to feel so trapped. His words became a lifeline, something she clung to when the weight of her life felt unbearable. At first, their conversations were innocent. They complained about work, gossiped about customers, and shared stories about their past. But over time, the discussions became more personal. Everly confided in Kieran about how unhappy she was with Nolan. She told him about the arguments, about how Nolan was never home, about how she felt invisible in her own relationship. Kieran was sympathetic, offering comfort and validation. He told her she deserved to be with someone who truly appreciated her. The more they talked, the closer they became. Soon, Everly started staying late after her shifts, lingering in the back of the diner with Kieran long after they had closed up for the night. Their connection grew stronger, and before long, it turned into something more than friendship. The secrecy of it thrilled her. It was the escape she had been craving. But the excitement was always temporary. No matter how much time she spent with Kieran, she always had to go back home to Nolan. Every night, she walked into the same small apartment, saw the same tired man sitting on the couch, and felt the same crushing disappointment settle in her chest. She knew she couldn't keep living this way. She wanted to be free of Nolan, but divorce or breaking up would be messy. There was the apartment, their son, the financial burden of splitting up. Everly didn't want to deal with any of it. She just wanted a clean break, a fresh start, and an easy way out. One night, after closing, she sat in the back of the diner with Kieran, their voices low as they spoke about her future. She admitted she had thought about leaving Nolan, but didn't know how. Kieran listened intently, nodding as she vented. Then, almost casually, he mentioned that there were other ways to get rid of someone. At first, she brushed it off as a joke, but as the days passed, the idea lingered. She found herself considering it more seriously. What if Nolan was just gone? What if she didn't have to deal with custody battles, financial struggles, or the judgment of others? What if she could simply move on with her life, free from the weight of the past? Kieran was the first to bring up a plan. He told her it could be simple. Nolan worked long hours, meaning he was exhausted by the time he got home. It wouldn't take much effort to catch him off guard. If they made it look like a random break-in, no one would ever suspect them. Everly hesitated at first, but the more Kieran talked, the more sense it made. He assured her they would be careful. They would make it look like a robbery gone wrong, and once it was done, no one would question it. Everly knew what they were discussing was wrong, but she didn't stop him. She didn't say no. Instead, she listened, considering every word. The more she thought about it, the more the idea started to feel like a solution instead of a crime. By the end of the night, she had made her decision. She was going to be free no matter what it took. Everly spent the next few days carefully planning every detail. She knew that if they made a single mistake, everything would fall apart. She and Kieran agreed that the break-in had to look real, with enough evidence to convince the police that Nolan had been the unfortunate victim of a burglary gone wrong. They decided to stage it at night while Nolan was asleep, ensuring he wouldn't have time to react or fight back. Kieran would be the one to carry out the actual attack, while Everly would provide the perfect alibi. She would take her son and stay at her sister's house overnight, making sure she was nowhere near the apartment when everything happened. In the morning, she would return, pretend to discover the scene, and call the police in hysterics. To anyone watching, it would seem like she had narrowly escaped a tragedy. On the night of the murder, Everly packed an overnight bag for her son and kissed Nolan goodbye as if nothing was wrong. He was already exhausted from work and barely looked up from the couch. She left the apartment, got into her car, and drove away, making sure she was seen by her sister and her neighbors to solidify her alibi. Meanwhile, Kieran waited in his car a few blocks away, watching the apartment for any movement. Once the lights inside went out and everything was quiet, he made his move. He parked around the corner and walked toward the back entrance, wearing gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints. He used a crowbar to pry open the window, making sure to leave visible signs of forced entry. He climbed inside, moving carefully through the dark apartment, listening for any sign that Nolan was awake. But there was nothing. The only sound was the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floor beneath his feet. Nolan was asleep in the bedroom, his breathing slow and steady. Kieran had rehearsed this moment in his head over and over again. He had told himself it would be quick, that Nolan wouldn't suffer, that it was the only way to give Everly the life she deserved. He gripped the metal pipe he had brought with him, raised it above his head, and brought it down hard. The first hit wasn't enough. Nolan let out a sharp gasp, his body jerking in pain. Kieran panicked, swinging again and again until everything went still. Blood pooled across the bed, soaking the sheets and dripping onto the floor. Kieran took a shaky breath, wiping the sweat from his forehead. It was done. He moved quickly, dragging Nolan's body out of the bedroom and into the living room. He knocked over a lamp, threw a few drawers open, and scattered belongings across the floor to make it look like a robbery. He even stole a few valuables, Nolan's wallet, a watch, and some cash, to make the story more convincing. Before leaving, he used a rag to wipe down anything he had touched, making sure there were no fingerprints left behind. Then, he slipped out the back door, disappearing into the night. Everly had been waiting anxiously at her sister's house, checking her phone for any updates. When she finally received the message from Kieran that it was done, she felt a wave of relief wash over her. The hardest part was over. Now, all she had to do was play her role perfectly. The next morning, Everly returned to the apartment, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. The sight of Nolan's lifeless body made her stomach turn, but she forced herself to react as if she had no idea what had happened. She screamed, dropped to the floor, and dialed 911 with shaking hands. When the police arrived, she played the part of the devastated girlfriend flawlessly. She told them she had been at her sister's house overnight and had come home to find the apartment in chaos. She sobbed, insisting that Nolan had been a good man and that she couldn't understand why someone would do this. The officers listened carefully, taking notes as they examined the crime scene. Everything seemed to point to a burglary, just as Everly and Kieran had planned. But what they didn't know was that the cracks in their story were already beginning to show. The investigation began immediately, with police scouring the crime scene for evidence. To them, it appeared to be a straightforward case, A burglary turned violent. The signs of forced entry, the missing valuables, and the ransacked apartment all pointed to a break-in gone wrong. The officers took Everly's statement, noting her distressed state and the way she clutched her son protectively, as if the fear hadn't left her since she made the gruesome discovery. She described her relationship with Nolan, painting a picture of a hard-working man who never made enemies. She explained that she had been staying at her sister's house overnight, a fortunate decision that had likely saved her and her child's life. Everything she said sounded believable, and the officers reassured her that they would do everything in their power to find whoever had done this. But as detectives began looking deeper into Nolan's murder, small inconsistencies in the scene started to surface. The break-in seemed too staged, almost as if it had been carefully arranged rather than the chaotic result of a real robbery. The missing valuables were minor compared to what had been left untouched. Most burglars would have taken expensive electronics, but Nolan's TV, laptop, and other high-value items remained in place. Instead, only small, easily transportable things had been stolen, as if someone was trying to make it look like a crime of opportunity. The medical examiner's report only added to the detective's suspicions. The nature of Nolan's injuries suggested he had been attacked while he was sleeping, with no signs of struggle. This didn't align with the typical patterns of a break-in gone wrong. If Nolan had woken up to an intruder, there would have been defensive wounds or signs of a fight, but there were none. It was almost as if he had never seen his attacker coming. As police continued their investigation, they looked deeper into Everly's life. They interviewed friends, co-workers, and anyone who might have insight into her relationship with Nolan. While most people spoke about Nolan as a devoted father and a hard-working man, some mentioned that Everly had been unhappy in the relationship. A few even hinted at the possibility that she had been seeing someone else. When detectives questioned Everly's co-workers at the diner, they noticed an interesting detail: her close friendship with Kieran Holt. Several employees mentioned seeing them together often, talking in hushed tones after closing hours, and even leaving work at the same time on multiple occasions. While this alone wasn't enough to raise serious suspicion, it was enough to warrant a deeper look into Kieran. They pulled Kieran's phone records, checking for any unusual activity. What they found was damning: dozens of late-night calls and messages exchanged between him and Everly, including one sent just hours before Nolan's murder. The texts were deleted, but phone logs didn't lie. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses added another piece to the puzzle. A grainy camera across the street had captured a dark figure entering the alley behind Everly and Nolan's apartment that night. Though the footage wasn't clear enough to provide an identity, the figure's movements and build seemed consistent with Kieran. The detectives knew they needed more evidence before making any arrests, so they kept their suspicions quiet while continuing to gather proof. They decided to monitor Everly and Kieran closely, hoping they would slip up. Meanwhile, Everly believed they had pulled off the perfect crime. She played the grieving girlfriend convincingly, attending Nolan's memorial with tear-filled eyes and thanking everyone who came to offer their condolences. She acted as though her world had been shattered, but deep down, she felt a sense of relief. Nolan was gone, and her life was finally hers to control. What she didn't realize was that the police were closing in. The evidence was stacking up against her and Kieran, and soon, their carefully constructed lie would begin to unravel. Everly had convinced herself that she was in the clear. The police had bought into the burglary story. The evidence seemed to support their version of events, and no one suspected her involvement. She moved through the days with a carefully crafted sorrow, accepting condolences, making funeral arrangements, and ensuring that she played the role of a devastated widow convincingly. But beneath the surface, things weren't as secure as she thought. Detectives had continued their quiet investigation, piecing together inconsistencies that pointed to something far more sinister than a random break-in. The phone records linking her to Kieran were only the beginning. Detectives knew that if Everly and Kieran had planned this murder together, they would have had to communicate about it in some way. They obtained a warrant to search both of their phones, hoping to recover deleted messages. The forensic team worked quickly, retrieving months' worth of conversations. The texts were incriminating. There were long discussions about how unhappy Everly was with Nolan, how she wished he would just disappear, and subtle references to a plan that had to be handled carefully. The most damning messages were exchanged just days before the murder, with Everly asking Kieran if he was ready, and Kieran reassuring her that it will all be over soon. Armed with this information, detectives decided to turn up the pressure. They visited Kieran at the diner, asking casual but pointed questions. Kieran tried to remain calm, but his unease was obvious. His hands trembled slightly as he spoke, and his answers were inconsistent. He claimed he barely knew Everly outside of work, yet other employees had reported seeing them together constantly. He insisted he had been home on the night of the murder, but he couldn't provide any solid alibi. The detectives left without arresting him, but he knew they were watching. Everly remained unaware of just how much the police knew. She continued, playing her part, thinking she had outsmarted everyone. She spent more time with Kieran, no longer needing to hide their relationship. She believed they had done everything right. The apartment had been staged, her alibi was airtight, and the police had no evidence placing Kieran at the scene, but the pressure was getting to Kieran. Unlike Everly, he wasn't as composed under scrutiny. He could feel the detectives closing in, and paranoia began to creep into his thoughts. He started questioning everything. Had he left any fingerprints? Was the staged burglary convincing? Enough? Were the police onto them? Every time he saw a patrol car near the diner, his stomach twisted in knots. His anxiety grew worse when he noticed an officer parked outside his apartment. He knew they weren't there for anything else. They were watching him, waiting for him to crack, and the more they watched, the more he felt himself unraveling. He started avoiding Everly, ignoring her calls and texts. She noticed his change in behavior, growing frustrated and paranoid herself. If Kieran couldn't handle the pressure, he might do something reckless. The detectives were counting on that. They knew that in most conspiracies, one person always broke before the other. They kept applying pressure, letting Kieran feel the weight of the investigation while keeping Everly in the dark. Then, the final piece of evidence surfaced. The surveillance footage from a convenience store down the street. The blurry camera, across the street, had only captured a shadowy figure, but this new footage was clearer. It showed Kieran walking past the store just minutes before the time of Nolan's murder. The timestamp confirmed he had been in the area when he claimed to be home. It was enough to bring him in. When officers arrived at the diner and placed him under arrest, he didn't resist. He was shaking, his face pale. The moment he was alone in the interrogation room, his resolve crumbled. When faced with the evidence against him, it only took one question for him to break. Was Everly involved? Kieran's silence was brief. Then he began to talk. Kieran didn't hesitate for long. He knew the police had enough evidence to link him to the crime, and the pressure had become unbearable. He wanted out. With his head in his hands, he admitted everything. The affair, the plan, and how Everly had been the mastermind behind it all. He told detectives how she had convinced him that Nolan was the only thing standing in the way of their happiness, how she had manipulated him into believing that the only solution was to get rid of him. He described the night of the murder in vivid detail, his voice shaking as he spoke. He confessed to breaking into the apartment, staging the burglary, and attacking Nolan while he was asleep. He explained how Everly had meticulously planned every step, from making sure she was nowhere near the crime scene to ensuring she had witnesses who could vouch for her. Kieran thought they had been careful, that they had done everything right, but now he realized just how wrong they had been. Detectives listened carefully, allowing Kieran to spill every detail, but they weren't about to take his word alone. They needed to confront Everly and see how she would react when faced with betrayal. Later that day, police arrived at Everly's apartment. She greeted them with feigned confusion, playing the role of the grieving girlfriend who couldn't understand why they were there. But the moment they informed her that Kieran had confessed, her expression changed. Her eyes darted back and forth as she struggled to maintain control. She denied everything, insisting that Kieran was lying to save himself. But the detectives had more than just his confession. They had phone records, deleted texts, surveillance footage, and now Kieran's full testimony. The web of lies Everly had spun was unraveling faster than she could keep up with. When they placed her under arrest, she screamed, cursing Kieran's name and insisting that she had nothing to do with it. As she was taken into custody, the reality of her situation set in. She had orchestrated everything, believing she was too smart to get caught. But now, her perfect crime had crumbled, and there was no way out. The trial was swift and highly publicized. Prosecutors presented the overwhelming evidence against both Everly and Kieran, laying out the meticulous planning that had gone into the murder. Kieran, in a desperate attempt to reduce his sentence, testified against Everly, detailing how she had manipulated him into carrying out the crime. The jury saw through Everly's lies, and in the end, both were convicted. Kieran for the murder itself, and Everly for conspiracy to commit murder. Kieran received a lengthy prison sentence, but Everly's fate was even worse. The court showed no mercy, recognizing her as the true mastermind behind the crime. She was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. The judge made it clear there would be no second chances for someone who had so cruelly plotted the murder of the father of her child. In the aftermath, Nolan's family mourned the loss of a man who had done nothing but love and provide for his son. They took custody of the child, ensuring he would never grow up under the influence of the woman who had destroyed his father's life. Everly sat alone in her prison cell, replaying every decision that had led her to this moment. She had thought she was in control, that she had created the perfect plan. But in the end, the truth had caught up with her. No matter how carefully she had tried to cover her tracks, justice had found her.